Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks. I only caught the tail end of the last one, and I'm sorry I missed earlier today, unfortunately. Really looking forward to this conversation. We live in interesting times, and I'm going to dive into. You're going to see lots of network diagrams. I study networks. That's what I do for a living. And I should have said this, David, halfway through your introduction. I'm actually no longer with AWS. I decided to go out on my own with a group of friends to launch and start something called the Connected Commons, which is in essence looking at how do we apply network science to this challenge of hybrid work. So super interested in this conversation. I'm going to pop up slides in a second, but I would much rather, I always have more content than time, and I'd much rather us have the conversation that you're interested in. So I only have one request, and that is that you're completely irreverent and interrupt me mid-sentence in order to clarify something or challenge something or ask a question. And the more we can make this a dialogue, the better off I think it will be for everybody. And clearly that's what you were doing in the previous session. So let me go ahead and get us started. And as I've mentioned, I always have more than enough material, but we live in interesting times, right? And I've been studying networks for the better part of 2 decades, along with people like Rob Cross and Ron Burt and other people in this world. And in essence, I think even we, I'm a self-proclaimed social scientist, and even myself and we who've studied this stuff for years, we're quite stunned at what happened when we were propelled into exclusively remote work as a result of the pandemic. And I'll share a few of those stories. I'll talk about connections, and then most importantly, I'll talk about what are some of the things we should be thinking about when we're working remotely, and perhaps what are a few of the advantages to still getting together face to face in a very intentional manner, not in the silly, hey, let's do this 2 days a week or 5 days a week type of thing. So I'll dive in. You can stop me at any time, so please do. This is how we usually talk about organizations. It's a human capital centric lens. We usually think of organizations as org charts and stored up human capital, smart people, great experiences, or ability to teach them. This is how organizations actually operate. And the reality is, Karen Stevenson, if you know her work, would say about 80% of knowledge transfer happens on the right side, not the left side. And oftentimes I'll ask the question, and we'll be a little interactive here, like who's in charge in this org? And you would say James, and I would argue with you, no, it's really not James, it's Mitchell. And the reality is both, but we tend to think about leaders, we tend to think about organizational charts, but the reality is the way work gets done is on this other lens, this social capital lens, this network lens. And we are, through the pandemic in particular, we know this more than ever. We've always known this, we've always said it, but it was more of a nicety than a requirement about the way we think about work. And my simple definition of human capital is sort of your stored up experiences, disciplines, learnings, where social capital is how well positioned you are to leverage that or access that from somebody else. And clearly in this particular illustration, you can see Mitchell is even buried 3 deep inside this organization, is far more instrumental to the day-to-day network than James is as an SVP. And we know this, like I'm only setting the context to get into some arguments, but we know that connections matter. This was Microsoft's done some extraordinary work in looking at how we're connected and what matters more than ever in this hybrid context. And there are all kinds of studies. If you've got strong relationships, you're much more likely to be fulfilled, have satisfaction with your employer, lower levels of stress, work stress, have a sense of well-being. And then a couple of the core ones I'll focus on are be more productive and be more innovative. Even though the last one's not in their research, we found that to be true. But I got to go a little bit deeper, because talking about connections in general, or even talking about Mitchell versus James, isn't enough. There are really 2 types of connections that matter immensely to organizations. And the reason it's important for me to be specific about this is because they both showed up differently in the virtual work, pandemic, remote work environment, and they both will likely show up differently in whatever this world of hybrid manifests in. And the first one is basically what we call bonding social capital. And here you can see bonding social capital in these small little clusters of tightly knit teams. Usually these are one team, maybe two teams connected to each other, but smaller groups. And bonding social capital is really important for speed and experimentation, therefore driving some innovation. It's one of the ways we get agile work done is by going small and rapid iterations. And the smaller you are, the more speed you can deliver on. And then the second thing, and not surprisingly, is it drives performance. And it turns out that performance increased. And there are all kinds of statistics, and we can counter argue this, but net performance remained equal or increased for knowledge workers when we leaned into remote work. One of the primary arguments for that is because bonding social capital increased. And I'll talk about why here in a moment. But the second type of social capital is bridging social capital. And it's these, individuals who, we would sometimes call them brokers, who link up teams or bridge across teams or functions. And they are critically important, especially to innovation, because they bring in new insights, up to 25% more insights if you have a bridging connection. And they're really instrumental in helping you to scale ideas from those small pockets out to the broader organization, 3x more important. So it's really important to think about these two types of social capital, because we've got to think about how these show up in the context of hybrid. And it turns out that, again, more Microsoft data, but Amazon data completely mirrors this, as does a number of other organizations, Uber and others. Basically, what we saw was a radical decrease of bridging networks immediately into the pandemic. This data only runs through 2021, but basically what you see from that first point to the fourth or fifth point is about a 30% drop on average. And those bridge connections between teams almost dissipated immediately at about a third of the rate. While in the inverse also happened. Our ability to work with our own teams actually increased. And our number of interactions, no matter how you measure this is through emails and instant messaging here, but we've measured this dozens of different ways. And we see while the extent may change, the pattern's the same. We leaned into our teams at the expense of working across the organization. And on the network, it looks a little bit like this. This was a pre-pandemic network. This is a pretty healthy network, maybe even over-connected, but you can see individual functions based on color codes, some bridging across those functions, in some cases, a lot of bridging. This is only 10 months into the pandemic, same organization, 23% decline in connections at large, and the majority of those were bridging connections. Fast forward, and you can see, now we don't just have silos across functions, we have silos within teams or within functions, and you get this sort of constellation effect. I described it as the neighborhood effect, where we become more neighborhood-like than organization-like. This really matters as we think about innovation and long-term growth. It got even worse as we continued to study this across time. This is a different organization that's experienced, this is probably the largest drop I've seen, a 41% overall decline in 15 months, same neighborhood effect. And you can see that this overall network began to deteriorate, especially as it relates to how functions are connected to functions, departments to departments. And what that means is our ability to sync up with each other and our ability to discover has been compromised, at least in the short term. And to take that a step farther, if you think about innovation, it's really, and you could use any methodology, this is the methodology that I've used in the past. You really have to discover new ideas, learn, design is incredibly good for coming up with new ideas, new insights. You then have to put them into the world by building them. Usually those small teams, bonding teams, are really good at helping to develop those quickly using agile methodologies. And then at some point, you need to get them out of the small pockets and you need to scale them out across the org. And what we saw immediately was an erosion in the number of new ideas inside of an organization. And in some cases, the hindrance of scaling on the back end of the innovation curve. And this happened almost immediately. So it leads me to this question: what about the new rules of work? What does that mean? And let me just pause maybe here. Any questions on any of this before I dive into my perspective based on some of the data as to what we should be thinking about? But I'll pause. Any questions, challenges at this point?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody else does. Let me put it in gallery so I can see the other question raisers. Based on your data, it looks to me like is it accurate to say that bridging is a less intimate or human deep form of connection?
Yeah.
If that's true, is that part of why, from the outside at least, and I have no data to back this up, it looked like the digital first orgs, which typically have more processes and tech adoption and those kinds of, infrastructure ways of creating cross-team collaboration, didn't see as much disruption?
That is absolutely true. Yes. And so you can think of these also. Sometimes I don't use this language. These aren't completely synonymous with one another, but bridging ties have the propensity to be more weak ties. They don't have to be. You could have a strong bridging tie, but on average, they're weaker in nature, more acquaintances that you don't have interactions with daily. So therefore, they're more fragile. And I'll talk more about that here in a few moments. On the other hand, your team interactions tend to be more intimate. We would oftentimes call those strong ties. And they're much more durable in this remote environment. But you're super astute in your comment. Those companies who had figured out how to make bridging connections formalized or had the formal mechanisms to ensure that those bridging connections continue saw less of a dissipation than those that did not. So great question. Great question. Any others before I dive forward? You're going to have plenty more, trust me.
I was wondering how much of the bridging comes out of personnel. Like, how does an organization encourage the bridging connections? Because you can talk about the technology and the opportunities, but even in the first graphs that you had, it's suggesting that there are individuals within those networks who are bridgers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do you ensure and how do you amplify the bridgers in a healthy way, if that's the case?
Here's what it generally is not. Inside of a work environment, personality is not really a strong characteristic. So I oftentimes get this question: I'm an engineer, I'm an introvert, so I should never be a bridge person. Generally speaking, there's not a pattern between introvert and extrovert as to who's a bridge and who isn't. It has much more to do with your role, your expectations of your role, or your level of curiosity, your level of, generally they would be innovators. They would be people looking for new things. They would be people who are constantly looking out. And I'll give you the consummate broker here in a few moments. So there is certainly a personality or an individual trait element, but it's generally not a personality trait thing, if that helps. So hold on, maybe hold on to some questions. I'm probably going to answer some of these, but again, keep firing away and interrupt me. But I think I'm going to answer a handful of these questions in a little more detail in a moment. Cool? Okay, I'm going to keep firing away. So what about the new rules of work? It's interesting. There's like this, I call it the great debate of hybrid. Unfortunately, we haven't brought much data to the equation. That's why I love what you're doing here and why you're bringing concepts, data, and discussions to have good, healthy, evidence-based debates around this. I call it the attitudes and platitudes argument. If you're a leader sitting on top of the organization, you're throwing out lots of platitudes like we're a connected culture company. We got to be back in the office. Or, I think it was Jamie Dimon that said, it's hard to be a hustler when you're remote. We're getting, these leaders who are tossing on all these platitudes about why you need to come back. And then if you're an employee, which is usually the opposite reaction, you've proven that you can be productive and you love the flexibility, you're showing up with the attitude like, why in the world would you call me back into the office if I've proven I can be successful? And if you do, I quit. And so we've resorted to like this attitudes and platitudes argument. And what I hope to do here in the next few moments is try to bring some evidence to this, try to bring some data-based arguments to this, because both are true. Both of those statements are true, but there's actually a way that we can think about this and again, the mission of what you've done over these last 3 days is to elevate work beyond where it was before, not to force people to come back into the office, but to think about when they should, and then to elevate the future of work at a whole different horizon. And I think all the evidence points to that being a very likely possibility if we can get past these attitudes and platitudes, if you will. One of the surveys we did, when you strip out what you prefer and you ask people this question, what could you most effectively do face-to-face versus in the office, remotely, I'm sorry. And this is what we come out with. Most people would say, even if they prefer to stay remote, that from time to time, 41% of respondents, I'd like to come back in and re-energize teammates. Energy is a whole different issue. From time to time, I think I could influence key stakeholders more face-to-face. And when I'm doing deep concentration work or just sharing general knowledge, I can do that as well remotely as any other time. So we think that, certainly preferences matter, and there are certainly some things we can do more effectively, although all of these things can be done remotely with a little more intentionality, as we've already talked about. But there are 3 things that I'm going to argue are bigger areas of concern that the science would suggest may need more face-to-face time. And the 3 things are these 3 things, and I'll try to argue this the whole way through the rest of the presentation. There is a discovery advantage to being together face-to-face from time to time. There is a cohesion advantage, especially for new teams, not maintaining social capital, but establishing it. And then there is an influencing or I sometimes call it energy advantage. And, it's just bottom line true. Energy translates better in a face-to-face environment. Doesn't mean that we can't do fun, interesting, cool things remotely and approximate that energy transfer. But if we don't do that, getting back together will in fact help to enhance energy a bit more. If we don't focus on unfortunately, let me say it this way, unfortunately, declaring silly things like being in the office 2 times a week doesn't necessarily consider these advantages or the need to structure for these advantages in the right manner. I sometimes describe it as playing the social lottery, for organizations that are in fact demanding their employees come back to the office 2 days a week. They increase their odds of these 3 things, but not by much. It's kind of like playing the social lottery. In fact, real math, if you're trying to discover new novel insights by just randomly saying every employee needs to be in the office 2 days a week, you increase your chances of discovery by approximately 4% versus staying completely remote. So not a huge lift for all the sort of burden it's carrying for demanding people, mandating people come back into the office. You get a little bit of a better lift if you're talking about building cohesion, just based on the chance effect. And it's probably something less than 16%. It is something less than 16%, as there are qualifiers for who and how you connect if you're trying to drive influence. So I oftentimes say, even if now there's a strong argument to say we can get better and work remotely exclusively, but there's, even if you're trying to generate one of these 3 advantages, you got to be far more intentional than just simply saying 2 days a week in the office. Otherwise, you only slightly increase your odds. So I'm going to try to make that argument, but to do that, I got to give you stories and illustrations. And first, I'll share a story about this guy, and you all of course, know this is Steve Jobs, and I would ask you, please describe Steve Jobs, and you would say, he was an innovating, a brilliant innovator, or strategic, strong visionary, and those are all true. Some people might say very difficult individual to get along with, and I would say those are all descriptions of Steve Jobs' human capital characteristics. From a social capital perspective, he was constantly building networks and connecting the dots, looking backwards. And just to prove that for a moment, Steve Jobs was the consummate broker. This is real network data, Apple patent data, and this is Steve Jobs. You can see him just above 6 o'clock right here. And Steve Jobs doesn't have the largest number of connections inside the network. He doesn't have the largest network or the most connections, but he does have the most diverse set of connections. In other words, Steve Jobs is a bridge person, which predisposes him to have early access to new ideas and access to novel and diverse information, which in fact would probably have more to do with his ability to innovate than anything else. And this is in fact what we're losing during these times. And we've got to be thinking much more intensely about how do we build these bridge connections and how do we constantly discover. So I'll share, I was at General Motors a few years ago before I joined Amazon. And one of the things we did there was we looked at these 3 types of innovations: discovery, development, and diffusion. And we leveraged it to really sort of jumpstart the innovation processes. And one of the things right away, I'll go back one slide if I could. One of the things right away is if you sell trucks in Kansas, which General Motors does a lot of, and urban environments are growing pre-pandemic at about a 2% increase annually. And in fact, all of the world's increase in population is happening in urban environments. You might not have the right solutions or ideas in order to work in this environment if you sell trucks in Kansas. Nothing against trucks in Kansas, but the world's population is going in a different direction, and you better get into this environment and study this environment, which is exactly what they did. They sent a small group of people using design thinking methodologies out into Manhattan and the streets of San Francisco, literally, and Shanghai, and they started asking questions around what is it that you need from a mobility standpoint to customers? And they started to watch things from a mobility standpoint. And what they came back with was not super profound, because most of us know it in hindsight. And that is that it's probably more of a burden to own a vehicle inside of Manhattan than a benefit. Not only do you have to buy the vehicle, but you have to pay almost as much to park it as you do to buy it. And that earns you the privilege of sitting in heavily congested traffic when you can walk down the street maybe faster, 9 times out of 10. So the thought was, well, wow, we could fix that problem if we disrupted our own business model and started to think about a vehicle as an asset versus, something that somebody owns. And this team also knew that about 97% of a vehicle's occupancy is idle. So what if you could deploy a vehicle more full time and create Airbnb for your car, more fully deploy it? You could call that vehicle to you. So different than Uber or Lyft. In this case, you actually get the vehicle so you can drive it for the next 2 hours on a town. You can take it grocery shopping or use it for whatever utilitarian purpose you need. And you could actually fully deploy that in this network similar to Airbnb. That could have never happened with the insular mindset of the vehicle engineering organization at General Motors. They had to get out and they had to think about discovery at a whole different level. That's what it takes to really get out there and build these discovery connections. Problem is, in the virtual context, I've already mentioned it, these bridge connections are super fragile. that was an example of building them intentionally. But I showed you a few examples early on where they were eroding rapidly. And that happens even under natural conditions. Whenever you start to throw in pandemic level conditions and uncertainties, that drop off happens even faster. So you need to think, how do I reforge these connections? How might I reforge, and what might a new rule of work be in order to increase discovery? And one of the things to know, this through another study that was released last year, is proximity matters when you come back. If you want to discover something, the chances of you discover, and this is a study that was done, they divided a building into 4 quadrants. And if you happen to be in quadrant 1, which was the first quartile of the building, your chances of discovering something from another team were actually quite large. If you were in a different quadrant, your chances, the probability dropped significantly. In fact, it was almost negative. It was, in fact, negative compared to not being in the office in the first place. So proximity matters when we do get people back together. We've got to be thinking differently about how and when we would bring people together, and thinking about putting them in proximity in the same quartile of the building in this study, would be one rule that at least should be experimented with. Maybe it applies, maybe it doesn't directly, but it at least is a good empirical based study to be able to build some new rules on. That's not enough, however, with discovery. The more you don't know a team, the more likely you are to generate a breakthrough insight, actually at a 2-to-1 rate. So if you are already connected to a prior team, you do learn from them when you're back in the office, but in proximity with them. But if it's a new team that you've never interacted with before and has some sort of common feature or understanding or learning that you can have advantage on, you can actually increase your effect by 2-fold. So some potential rules, bring people in, put them in proximity with others they should be learning from, and think about the people that they don't already know, because you can connect virtually with the people you know. You tend not to do, you get more lift, more benefit by connecting with people you don't know in a physical environment. But let me keep firing through. And again, you're going to have some good questions for me, I'm sure. That's not enough. Discovery is important, but how do we develop? And at Amazon, we call them 2 pizza teams, small, nimble teams with a single focus that move really, really fast. At one point, these generated because at one point somebody said to Bezos, hey, we need to communicate better. And Bezos went on to say, I don't want to communicate. I don't want to make communication more efficient. I want there to be less of it. And the way there will be less of it is if a small team is working very intimately with one another and they're communicating in the flow of work, or they've earned so much trust with one another that they don't need to communicate because they are already in sync. And that's the way that you get speed and velocity inside organizations. And they went on to prove that as coordination increases, as the size of the team increases, it creates a bit of what we call tax on coordination tax. And you can see just simple math. If you've got 7 people, you got 21 different lines of communication. If you just increase that 3-fold, it's 45. And if you double it from 6 to 12, you go from 15 to 66. So what's that mean? We want to think about going smaller for speed. And it's really important to think about going much smaller and building 2 pizza teams. And here's a good illustration of a study that I conducted many years ago, where cohesion is highly correlated, in this case, to productivity, because the smaller your team is, the more likely you're in sync and automatically share things. This was a call center, and we were able to look at these 4 teams, a blue team, the magenta team, there's a red team and a gray team there. And one of the things you notice right away is the blue team and the magenta team are much more cohesive. And it turns out, but simple statistics, we were able to explain 37% of the variation by cohesion in productivity by cohesion alone. Then we did some interventions to help the teams, the other 2 teams and many others, become more cohesive. by as much as 30%. And we increased in the lab studies productivity by as much as 25%. This is one of the reasons why when bonding social capital increased, we saw productivity go up. This is one of the reasons why speed matters, and you're able to sustain social capital quite well in a virtual context. And in fact, we increased cohesion because we stopped interacting with people from beyond the team at the expense of working with teams. And by the way, that was even more true for leaders. Leaders at a 4x level lost their bridge connections, even more than general employees. And there's a very good reason. Leaders tended to lean into their teams and organizations to help them at the expense of working across the organization. Unfortunately, the side effect of that, as I've already mentioned, is the loss of discovery of new ideas. And that resulted in fewer ideas and ultimately less innovation. So let me maybe just land on this, and then I'm going to pause. As I've already mentioned, sustaining social capital virtually is not difficult, but building it is. Good news is you can do it. This is a study that was done on the University of Michigan pre-COVID back in 2001. It was published actually in 2002. And basically what they did was they looked at different communication channels, and at what point would a given individual earn optimal trust. And it was about 6 interactions, 5 to 6 interactions in face-to-face world, in-person world, that we established whatever average level of trust we were going to have with a different human being. In video, you can establish that threshold, but it takes about 3 times as many interactions. So the good news is it can be done. The bad news is it takes more work, more iterations. With audio, you can also do it, although you see a little bit of a drop off, and it takes about 5 times as many interactions to do that. So the challenge is, as the pandemic went on, we hired more and more people. More and more people were moving from team A to team B. More people were coming in from outside the organization. And all of a sudden now we started to see some bonding capital erosion, because ultimately what happened was, this increase in newness actually started to erode even bonding social capital. Something else happened, something else is happening right now, which is really important. I call this the activity avalanche. And that is that as work starts to kick back in, we held back the floodgates of activity for the longest of times. Now what we're starting to see in all of our client companies that we're looking at is they're taking on more priorities. So if there were 3 priorities during the pandemic, there are now 6 priorities, and the incoming of new things into any given team have exploded. And now what's happening is teams are becoming more and more overwhelmed, less and less connected. And what it's doing is beginning to slow things down. And if you've actually looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics productivity reports, you will see that at the beginning of the pandemic, it was the largest rate of incline in productivity in human history, ever since they took that metric. And if you will look at the end of last year, you will see that it is the largest decline, as this and the newness have kicked in. I'm sure there are other explanations. I cannot substantiate my argument on this, but as new things have started to hit us and burnout has kicked in, you're starting to see that productivity is being jeopardized as well. So I'm going to now pause here. I've got one last segment I want to get through, and then we can certainly have dialogue at the very end as well. But any questions or concerns, disagreements at this stage? Don't be shy.
I have the question, how do you get these graphics? How do you study the connections? What's the method?
There are all kinds of ways to do this. Thank you. There are all kinds of, I tend to jump past that question. Unfortunately, I shouldn't. There are all kinds of ways to do this. This particular one was done based on survey. And the simple question was, we asked people, who do you interact with on a day-to-day basis? They gave us 15 to 20 names. Then we asked, just like you would an engagement survey, you ask that same question of, I think this network, I'm not sure, I think this is about 400 people. And basically what happens here is each person redundantly calls out the same person. We map them on in these networks, and then we map on other traits on top of it. In this case, we also ask the question, how are you feeling about priority overload? In other words, taking on more and more incoming priorities. And you can see 53% of the respondents experienced that at an increase in level. So that's one way to do it. Some of the earlier graphs I showed you were through email interactions and or team meeting interactions. And that's, we can map out meetings, we can map out email interfaces, and those are different ways of being able to map all this out.
And the distance between the points?
So there's an algorithm, and basically what it looks at is as you're connected to the people on one side and they're connected to the people on the other side, it may pull your link between the two of you farther apart. So it's basically I could get into the science, but it's basically called Force Atlas. It's an algorithm, and it based on how often you interact with that person versus how often you interact with other people in the network, you'll see greater distance. If you're interacting with someone that other people close to you are interacting with frequently, the dots would be much, much closer to each other. That's the simplest way to think about it.
Thank you.
Good questions. Thanks. Anything else? I'm going to keep going then. So far, I've talked about why our bridge connections are so important to discovery, why our close connections, bonding connections, are so important to development. I now want to talk about something else, and I heard a tail end of the last conversation, and this would play out very well based on that conversation as well, and that is that energy also matters. So far, I've talked about network position, where you show up in the network. How you show up in the network also matters. And you could be an energizer or a de-energizer. That's your network disposition in this case. And basically what we see is your energy is contagious to others in both cases. The green dots are positive pockets. Those are high energized people, more energized than less. And you can see they tend to hang out with like-minded people. The other red dots are what my great colleague Rob Cross would call energy vampires. These are the people that, you leave a meeting with them and you're so exhausted because they just suck the life out of you in that meeting. And they take energy away from you, where the energizers give you energy at the end of a conversation. Why does this matter? Because at a 4x level, positive energizers help to drive diffusion of new ideas. In other words, if you're meeting with an energizer, they're far more likely to share your idea with someone else and pull other people into them to be able to diffuse that new idea. So energy matters immensely when we're talking about diffusing ideas. If you're trying to get your idea diffused, the worst thing to do is to take it to the cynics, to take it to the critics, because they're going to they play a role, by the way, at some future point, but they're going to prematurely kill your idea. And this matters because it's one, it impacts diffusion, and two, it also has showed up differently in the world of hybrid. So I'll tell you a quick little story. This is at General Motors. This is how we leverage this learning, this insight. We were trying to get innovation out of these small little pockets, these two pizza teams I described, and we're trying to get it scaled on across the organization. So we knew who the energizers were in the organization. So we actually had an old movie theater, actually a new movie theater that was not being used. And we actually opened up the movie theater from the front of the stage for 1 hour. We used fun, Pechacuchu style, high energy presentations where people would spend no more than 3 to 4 minutes pitching their idea, pitching their concept. And in the auditorium, which is the most important part, we had nothing but 350 energizers. So we invited energizers, we gave them popcorn, They were there to listen for the hour, listen to these high energy presentations. Then we opened up the foyer immediately behind a movie theater, and out in the foyer was like a living science fair. And that science fair had all the ideas that were presented, as a science booth, and many, many more. And basically, 350 people, went out in the hallway and started roaming around, buzzing up each other's ideas and linking them up to other people. There was for example, somebody built an onboarding app, a real prototype of an onboarding app, and 3 or 4 people gathered in the foyer and started thinking about how to partner with IT, how to partner with HR, how to get that adopted, who was owning that project today. And that ended up streamlining that process and getting a new tool implemented in a matter of months, which maybe would have taken, better part of a year if they hadn't gone through this process. So that's how you can seed the network for diffusion. Here's the problem now that we're in this hybrid world, and that is that we're losing energy at a much larger rate than I've ever seen inside the network. There's a ratio, a 3-to-1 ratio. Organizations that have a 3-to-1 ratio of more energizers than de-energizers are far more innovative over time. And what we've seen is that's inversed since the pandemic. This is an organization pre-pandemic and then 20 months later. So same human beings for the most part, few people changed. And what you see is that they lost energy. Along with that, they've lost the psychological safety necessary to be creative and present new ideas. And along with that, they've lost diffusion capacity in order to truly get new ideas pushed out. And that has an impact on influencing. We saw that, I think I may have shared this story earlier. We saw that very early on in the pandemic when the video game industry was at its height, and they could have taken on more new video games in the market. We started to see delays at a 4x time rate in hybrid versus pre-hybrid, or in remote versus pre-remote. And one of the primary reasons for that is the bridge connections of influence and across started to break down. So the ability to scale on the back end ended up becoming a problem, frankly, because there's a lot of science. It says we influence people through energy in our nonverbals. And you can see that here, 3 very positive gestures on the top side of this chart. A handshake represents mutual respect, especially a leaning handshake if you're leaning in. This tilted head is openness or curiosity. What you can't see the dynamic nature of the hand motions, but mimicking somebody else's behavior or mirroring somebody else's behavior is generating higher rapport. And then you can see clearly some more negative emotions on the bottom. The eye rub is, you're giving me a headache, and I sure hope that when I open my eyes up, you're gone, because I just don't like this. The thumb tuck is basically a way of self-protection, or the arm or hand tuck is I'm ready to explode, so I better hug myself if nobody else. You've got these. We are social creatures, and these things, these traits, help us as we're thinking about influencing other people. And these are some of the things that break down in Zoom land. And it's exactly what we've seen. What we've seen inside of networks is that we've lost discovery and we've lost this influencing emotion. This is one example, but it's a very typical pattern of what we're seeing. We've gotten a little bit better at scaling or formal endorsement. So we've got formal mechanisms in this case to really help to scale ideas. But the informal things of getting ideas started on the front end or scaled on the front end have dropped. And they're pretty good at building, but not building new ideas. So this is an organization that we can measure, that is spending too much energy on execution at the expense of discovery. And this is generally what we're seeing inside of organizations today. So I think I'm going to pause there and just ask you what questions you have. I, of course, could go on and have all kinds of other stuff, but I'm going to pause here. What Well, my last comment would be, I'll just stop sharing. My last comment would be, I've been very careful not to say we have to get back to the office. I don't believe that. I believe that there are times where if you are going to force that maneuver, be intentional about it, get the most out of it, create moments that matter. I also believe that intentionality trumps proximity. And what I mean by that is we've lost proximity in the virtual land. If we can get, as we were just talking at the beginning of this conversation, if we can get more intentional about building connections and building formal tools and mechanisms, we can actually approximate proximity in a virtual land. I believe we'll end up being able to do both of those things. We'll be able to be very thoughtful about staggering people and bringing them back into the office for moments that matter for discovery or moments that matter for energy, re-energizing people and re-engaging them in the mission and purpose of the company. But I think equally as important, if not even more, is building some of those intentional tools to help people become more and more connected virtually and not leave it to chance. So now I'm finished and waiting for your questions. Thoughts? Is that all bogus? You wanna throw darts at that whole thing? Tell me where you're at.
There are some questions in the chat. Maybe.
Michael, I see a bunch of questions here about how do you detect positive energizers?
So there are lots of ways to do this. The way we did it in that chart is we asked this question, net, when you interact with this person, do you walk away more or less energized? And that's how we did it in the charts that I showed you. Actually, you'll notice one chart had red and green. The other chart only had green. And sometimes I don't ask if somebody's a de-energizer. I only ask to click on the people who are energizers to you in your network. That's what I did in that second chart, simply because I didn't have, let me say it this way. I didn't trust that that organization couldn't have used the de-energizer insights for harm. So more often than not, I only ask who are the energizers, but that's how we do it. I have used proxies for energy, like this person is highly engaged is another. Engagement and energy are not one for one, but they're highly correlated with each other. And so I have used engagement superimposed on the network because it's generally dependent on privacy and all those sorts of things, a trait that you can get access to.
So in the use case of GM, when you invited the 350 energizers,
Yes.
Was it a survey like that then, okay.
It was. So we asked on the survey. They knew it was an open survey, so they knew that we knew. We contracted with people at the front of that survey to say, hey, we'll keep your name confidential, but we would like to leverage the data for different purposes. And everybody opted in that particular case, and that's why we were able to go pick them. Great questions. What else?
Ross, do you want to ask that out loud?
Sure. Thanks so much, Michael, for your presentation. I'm wondering if you've seen examples of de-energizers becoming energizers. And I guess, is there a role to play in is an organization responsible for that? Is it a mix of just your personality and your other things going on in your life? And I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. It's highly, the short answer is it's highly dynamic. And I'm glad you asked this question because I may have made it sound a little more stable than it is. There are times it's the kick the dog syndrome, right? I just came out of a meeting with the boss and it wasn't so good. And I'm going to go kick the dog. That doesn't make me a de-energizer always, but I was a de-energizer in that moment. So it is very dynamic. So I see it shift frequently, which is one of the reasons we've seen this huge depletion of energy, in this virtual context. I'm highly concerned about this because energy is such a driver of so many other things. The answer is it's partially the organization's responsibility, but I would say that your teammates actually could have a bigger effect on it than anyone. The best case study I've seen on this was an organization that had a lot of low energy, and they actually hired leaders for the primary purpose of turning this organization unit around. And 3 leaders that were in the center of the network were able to significantly shift the energy levels in a matter of months. So you can change energy quickly, not always, but it's pretty dynamic. Leaders have a big effect on it for sure, but your peers, your teammates, also help to influence how you show up on a day-to-day basis in a big way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, Michael, I do have one question for you, because your world and the world of this experiment are entwined, but not, right?
Okay.
So in our experiment, in this phase, we're looking at a 2-hour period, in the experiment. What might we measure, or what might we do that help us potentially pull out lessons that would apply to influencing network effects over time?
The word that, so that's a probably a much more detailed response than the one I'm about ready to give you, and I would be thrilled to engage in that conversation if of use. The first thing I would say is form always follows function. So start with, what are you trying to do? Like what is the output? What is the intention? What is the, am I trying to discover? This is my language, but it could be any other language. Am I trying to develop new ideas? Am I trying to become higher productivity? That matters first, because when it comes to I hope if you've heard nothing else from me, when you think of your network, you have different social architectures that drive different outputs. So the first thing I would think about from a social connectivity standpoint is, what is the desired output? Then how close are you in your current constructs to being able to, encourage that, motivate and support that? And then, what do you need to do from a shift standpoint in the network? So that's how I tend to think about this. Every client we work with, this is our model. We got a flywheel. Is what is the business and what is the business outcome you're trying to drive? If it's well-being, which we haven't talked about, we will go collect social insights from your network, and then those social insights will inform interventions, new interventions and practices to help close the gap between where you are, where you should be, and the outcome that you desire. And the reason that's so important is, like, what the actions we would take to drive innovation would be almost in direct contrast with the actions we would use to drive execution. So you got to get very crisp on what you're trying to do first.
Excellent. And I will definitely take you up on that at some point.
Awesome. Glad to do so. Well, thank
Any
you.
last question? We got it?
Please. Any others?
Well, you just made a statement there which leaves me curious. When you talk about trying to help organizations to discern exactly what the outcome is, and the implication of what you said is you need to decide whether you want to foster innovation or you want to foster execution, because you can't do both. You're going to focus in one or you're going to focus in the other. I'm presuming that you can move from one to the other.
Okay.
So it's at this moment, at this time, we need to focus on innovation, for example.
Yeah, that is what I said. And it's more about where in the organization as well. So there are parts of your organization that you want focused on innovation. They should be designed differently than the parts. I used to say this at General Motors: trucks out the back door. Like, I'm not messing with that. That's an execution engine. It should continue to run the way that it runs. We shouldn't mess with it. We should only improve it. But if you're trying to create the most disruptive next self-driving vehicle, which General Motors has done, that requires a whole different set of social configurations. So, I don't want to speak uniformly across an org. It's with whatever pocket inside that org you're talking about at any given point in time. Great clarifier. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.